Good evening and welcome to the New York Society Library. My name is Jeanette Sanger and I'm a trustee of this wonderful library. We're getting ready to celebrate our 270th anniversary. And tonight we're so happy that we have John Sargent here. And he'll be speaking about his recent book, and our bookseller is about to arrive. I know you're going to want to buy the book, but he's not here right away. And the title is Turning Pages, The Adventures and Misadventures of a Publisher. And we have had some very amazing publisher members. Robert Giroux was a member of the library, William Shawn, and most recently, Jonathan Galassi. And now we have John Sargent to add to our roster of famous publishers. And from a one-room schoolhouse in Wyoming, John Sargent has had an incredible life so far. And I'm sure there will be a lot more amazing things to come. He worked at 3 different publishers before going to Simon & Schuster to run the children's book division. In 1996, he went to work as a CEO of St. Martin's Press. 3 years later, he was put in charge of Holtzbrink's U.S. publisher, and he was responsible for forming the company that is today's Macmillan. He worked there as CEO until the end of 2020, and now serves on 3 nonprofit boards, and I'm sure a lot of other interesting things. Mr. Sargent is a prominent figure in the book world, and while at Macmillan, was involved in industry-wide clashes with the government and over e-book pricing. Macmillan was the last of the major publishers to settle an antitrust suit over e-book pricing. Macmillan also fought against President Trump's attempt to stop the publication of Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury, defending the right of free speech. Yay. He has some amazing stories to tell. As a matter of fact, he was telling me about Buckingham Palace before everyone got here. And he said, walking up the stairs, it's a little bit like the Society Library. So you can just imagine that we're all at Buckingham Palace right now. And he talks about publishing Monica Lewinsky. And I'm very curious to read all of these stories, but we're so delighted he can be with us tonight to share some of his stories.
Try to start without the reading glasses. Does that work? Is that good? Okay, thanks for coming out in the pouring rain tonight. A gloomy night to get here. I have no PowerPoint tonight. I don't have a fancy speech. I thought I would start with answering 3 questions that I'm frequently asked about the book or the publishing industry, and then I'll get to your questions after that. But if you have questions in the middle, it's a small group here. Just sort of wave at me or yell out, "Hey, John," like that. We'll stop and talk. It's not. This is not. It's not a boom, boom, boom speech. It's just a few stories. So please interrupt and ask questions if you have them. The first question I'm going to try to answer is, how different was it growing up in rural Wyoming versus growing up in Manhattan? And I moved when I was 7 for the summer, and then 8. When I was 8, moved out there full time. And the biggest difference is rural Wyoming is pretty empty. Back when I moved out there, it was 1965. The average population density was 3 people per acre, and 3 people per square mile. Now, square miles and acres are hard to figure, particularly if you grow up in a city. So to assist you in that, I did some math. The population of density of Wyoming was, at that day, the equivalent of Manhattan having 66 people in it. Okay, that's how few people there were in Wyoming. There was no internet, of course. There was no TV. no first-run movies at the movie theater. There were 2 radio stations. One of them played 1 hour of what they called teen music a day. Anne Murray Snowbird had spent 18 months at #1, I think because of the fantastic lyrics. Spread your tiny wings and fly away. Take the snow back with you where it came from on that day. Phones were party lines. So 6 ranches. We lived about 21 miles outside of town. There were 6 ranches down the county road. All 6 shared the same phone line. So you'd be on the phone and, Mary Jane Collins would jump on and say, John, you need to get off the phone right now. I need to use it. We shared the phone for many years. A long distance call was about a day's wages, so nobody made them. But perhaps the best example of the remoteness was the U.S. mail. I grew up in getting our mail through Banner, Wyoming. Banner is 13 miles away, 8 miles of dirt road, and 5 miles of pavement. There's 1 building in Banner. There's 3 people. There was a convenience store and the post office. And there was the butcher. And when I say butcher, I'm not talking a New York butcher. The butcher was the guy you'd take your cow to, and he'd kill it, cut it up, and send it back to you in its respective pieces to put in your fridge. Mae Johnson ran the post office. My mom had a unique first name. Her name was Nelchie. She actually had only 1 name eventually, Nelchie. And in those days, we would get mail for Mom that said 2 words on the envelope, Nelchie, Wyoming. And it would get to us. My father was a publisher in New York. He would travel the world and he'd send me these fantastic postcards when he was traveling. And they generally said something like, the food here is spectacular, but it's been raining for the last week. That's what it would say, that type of thing. And May, the postmistress, was I think was concerned about this, so she would commence to write me notes on the letter. So I'd get the postcard, and there on the side, May would write something like, well, if he wants to see weather, he should come visit you out here. Or, geez, I don't know. That food doesn't, he'd write some fancy, he'd be in Paris writing about some food. I don't know, that food doesn't sound so good to me. And, every once in a while I'd write May back. And she would pick up the thing, and then the next day she'd send her response, another piece of paper in the mailbox. So the biggest difference between that and New York City is in New York, you get your letters faster, but they need a full address, and you don't get any notes from your post people here in New York. Second question, how did you decide to write a book, and why this book? It's a hard question. I don't remember when or how I decided to write a book. In 1992, I took a trip to the remotest part of Alaska. I found a guide to take us where no white man had gone before. She sadly said, I can't find that place, but I know a place where only 1 white man went through, and he went through 11 years ago. I said, well, that'll do. So we went through. It's fantastic scenery, extraordinarily remote, 2.5 weeks out in the bush. And we ended up coming down the Ambler River in these foldable canoes at the end. And when we arrived at this Indian village, this Inuit village, people had never seen anyone come down the river, a white man come down the river before. And the kids were running out, and we're giving them fishing lures for trinkets. And then we walk through the streets, and these kids come running up, high school kids, and they say, do you guys play basketball? And we're like, yeah. They had 3 of their kids get sick. The regional basketball tournament was that day in Ambler. Ambler has no paved streets. Middle of nowhere. No road that goes to it, only the river. And they recruited us, and we played 4 games. And the fantastic thing was, one of the guys I was with was a shooting guard from USC, right? And so we had this spectacular thing. And I got home. I tell people these stories, and they say, oh, you got to write that up. That's got to be Outside Magazine, Men's Journal. You got to do it. You got to do it. And I thought, I should do that because maybe I could do it. And then in 2013, in 1995, old cowboy died named Bobby Gibbs. His funeral was such a remarkable event. To this day, it is fascinating that it could exist in America today. When Bobby died, and I got home from that funeral, and I said, I better write that, because that's never going to happen again, ever. So I better write it. So I wrote that, and then in 2013, I took a surfing trip with my son. We had this remarkable day, such a day that I was almost overwhelmed by it by the end of the day. I thought, God, this is just magical. And I thought, I'm going to try to write a story about this single day. And in the story, I'm going to try to define, without saying it, what is truly magical about the father-son relationship, which is a different relationship from mother-daughter and father-daughter and all that. And so I set myself to work to do that. And those last two stories are both in the book, right? So I had some sort of momentum. But at the end of the day, probably the true roots of the book are here. This is called The Memoirs of a Publisher. I had a great-grandfather who started his own publishing company. Remarkable man. By the time he died, it was the largest publishing house in America. Still bears his name today. His name's Frank Nelson Doubleday. He was old and sick, and vibration made him feel good, so he was driven around in a car. In the car, he felt better, but he didn't want to waste his time. So he thought he would write a book for his family and his friends, not to be published, to describe what he did at work. All right, so this has always existed. We call it in the family the White Book. You'll see my book is also white. There's a little bit of an homage to him. I finally, only 15, 20 years, he's not a great writer. I finally got through it 15, 20 years ago. And I recall the stories were just fantastic in the book. They're fantastic. But there's a lot of dull stuff in between. I mean, lots of dull stuff. How to act in staff meetings, what to do about corporate real estate, real yawning stuff. And the guy stopped out of school to work when I think he was, 9 or 10 or something. So he's not, he's not a great writer as far as the writing goes, but he can really tell a story. So I decided when I wrote my book, I would write only the good stories and nothing else. So the attempt was to start from scratch, write the most memorable stories, and leave out all the stuff in the middle. So that's how the book started, and it was for family and friends. So it's good to be me. I know lots of editors. So when I got done, I called Jonathan Gillespie, who you mentioned, who's a pal, and I said, could you read this and tell me, is it any good and what I should do? And very nicely, he, several weeks later, he called me, he said, let's go to lunch. I thought, that's not good. He said it's very good. He said, you should actually publish it. It's very good, but we need to know the narrator. And I said, well, I don't want to talk about the narrator. And he said, you have to tell your audience who you are. They need to know you. And I said, Jonathan, I don't want to do that. And he said, well, you have to. And finally I looked at him and I said, listen, Jonathan, nobody wants to hear the story of Little Johnny Goes West. And he very nicely reached across the table, he put his hand on my forearm, and he said, everybody wants to hear about Little Johnny Goes West. So at that point, I said, okay, I will try it. So I put in the stuff about, growing up out west and all that, and I decided I would tackle my mother and my father. I'd give them a short story each. And then I decided as a challenge, which I can encourage all of you to try to do for fun, within a story about your parents, try to write a single sentence that defines your relationship with your mother and your father in a single sentence. So I tried to do that, right? So I gave myself these sort of, I don't know, challenges of how to keep it tight, because I always hate when you read, you pick up someone's autobiography and it's 100 pages in and you're in high school, for Christ's sake. It's terrible. Okay, so that was the impetus. So in the stories I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to read from no one wants to hear stories from my book. I'm going to read from my great-grandfather's book, because it's interesting. And one of the things you'll see is, and I use this, is you have to tell stories about people that people know. Because a great story about a guy named Joe Smith who nobody knows, when your kids or your grandkids are reading it, they're going to say, well, okay, that's a great story, but who the hell was this guy, right? It's much more powerful if it's people's names you recognize. So, with that, I'll read you a few segments from his book, and what you'll realize almost immediately is that author care in the old days is a lot better than author care today. I can tell you that as a recent author. So this is in the very beginning. It just sets the scene, right? One day my mother was riding in a Brooklyn horse car when a boy got in and delivered a circular to each passenger. At the time, General Custer had just been killed by Sitting Bull. The circular contained a picture of an Indian with the words, "Above you see the portrait of Sitting Bull, the murderer of General Custer. And below you find the address of F.N. Doubleday, Book and Job Printer, 106 First Place, Brooklyn, New York." My mother was horrified. I was about 10 or 12 years old. That is where printer's ink first let its poison into my blood. So he was young. So this one, to set the scene, you have, this is about Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. He's, my great-grandfather is friends with Andrew Carnegie, and he is going to see him. And Mr. Carnegie is meeting with Mr. Morgan. It appears that when he went back to tell Mr. Carnegie that I was downstairs, this is him writing about what happened, Mr. Carnegie turned to Mr. Morgan and said, "Mr. Morgan, I have told you the terms on which I would sell the Carnegie Steel Company. If you are favorable to the idea, you will close the deal. If not, I will ask you to excuse me, as I have made an engagement and my friend is waiting for me downstairs." That's my great-grandfather. Morgan was rather flabbergasted at this blunt statement and said he would accept Mr. Carnegie's offer. And thus, J.P. Morgan bought U.S. Steel. So here you have a true author care story, a stunning author care story. About Washington's birthday, 1899, he came down with pneumonia. Although I knew him well, I thought I was not in a position to do much to help him, and I shall never forget the evening of Washington's birthday, when I went to the Grenoble Hotel in New York, where they were staying, one of the worst hotels, by the way, in existence at the time, and found Mrs. Kipling in desperate shape. Her husband had developed double pneumonia. Her oldest child, Josephine, also had pneumonia. John had a cold, which they suspected was pneumonia, and Elsie, the youngest of all, was not well. To find themselves in a New York hotel in this position was about as tragic and sad as anything could be. I told Mrs. Kipling that I would do anything I could do to help. She asked me how long I could stay, and I told her that I would stay until Rudd was well, Rudd being Rudyard Kipling. So this is further on in the same paragraph. My job was to take care of the nurses, see that people were fed, provide plenty of whiskey of the finest quality from Mr. Carnegie's cellar, and do whatever was necessary to keep the ball going. One of the most difficult tasks of all was to see the reporters twice a day. The illness made a great sensation, and columns were printed about it on the first pages of the newspapers. I recalled that I was so tired that I could not remember my own name. This is great. I slept on the floor just outside the sick room and was busy with these various enterprises until I almost passed away. The whole thing is a horror in my mind, and I rather hate to think of it. But in the end, Mr. Kipling's life was saved, although Josephine died. It is not difficult to imagine the intimacy which came along with these constant associations, which lasted 3 months. I do not think I went to my office for at least 2 months, and I finally delivered him to his home in Rottingdean near Brighton, England. And in those days, that was by ship. A brief one from Mark Twain. In the meantime, Mark went on with his most droll and amusing conversation. He told me, among other things, that he had a perfect recipe for making a modern-day American publisher. Take an idiot man from a lunatic asylum and marry him to an idiot woman, and the fourth generation of this connection should be a good publisher from the American point of view. And I would like to note that I am, in fact, the fourth generation down. Okay, so we'll do Mr. Rockefeller last. I could not help but notice that he kept his eye on me when I was not looking. I presume he was sizing me up. I said nothing about his memoirs, hoping against hope that he would introduce the subject himself. One day, after 18 holes, he asked me to sit with him a few minutes on the piazza of the hotel. He said, "I'm inclined to ask you to do me a favor, but I fear it might be too much of a task." I asked him what it was and tried to indicate that it would be a pleasure for me. He said, "I would like to tell you the complete story of my life, which I have never told to anyone as yet, not even my own son. In this way, I would bring back into my memory things that might escape me and which are important, some of them of public importance. But I would only be willing to ask you to listen with the distinct agreement that if you are bored, you will tell me frankly, and we will end the sessions." I told him that I would take a chance on being bored, and if the worst came to worst, I would stop him in his narrative. So for 2 or 3 weeks, every day we sat on the piazza and he told me all the things that had happened to him since he was a small boy. It was really a tale of thrilling interest, told with a dramatic fervor which kept my attention from the start. Some of these things, of course, were never printed. At the time, I think he had no idea of ever printing any of the material. He simply wanted to make a record of it. I feared that the revelations were so intimate that I would never, ever have the cheek to ask him to give expression to them in ink and paper. So, if you can imagine, he has no tape recorder, right? And he tells further, he didn't take notes. He listened. And then he went back to work and he wrote the autobiography himself, which publishers don't do today. I can promise you that. Okay. Was that interesting at all? Yeah? Okay. I can go Teddy Roosevelt. We got a lot more of that stuff. Anyway, the last question I get all the time, don't you think publishing has gone to hell? It is just a disaster now, right? It's amazing that people say that all the time. So I'll say, well, no. I am old enough to have heard way back in the day that book publishing could not possibly survive the advent of the color television set. That was the belief. And it was the belief that it couldn't survive the digital transition. It is often a remarkably sort of the sky is falling cultural business, right? It is always the next thing is going to kill us or it's never going to be the same. Publishing is full of great number of young people and they're fantastic at what they do. The big 5 corporate publishers are more corporate than they used to be, but publishing is far more democratic than it's ever been. If you look at the advent of self-publishing, what small publishers can do, the amount of books published is far greater than it has ever been and sort of ever increasing. So the concept that it's flawed and failing is strange to me, and I don't buy it. Yeah.
When you say the concept of publishing Now, publishing means a company or an individual takes a manuscript
Yes.
and puts the manuscript in a form that gets sold to other people, either online or in print. And you
Yes,
can-
there's sort of two components of it. One is selecting the manuscripts,
Yeah,
then it's creating the actual book or the digital book or the audio book.
yeah,
And then the biggest component is selling and marketing that to the audience.
yeah, thank you.
And on the self-publishing side, that's the one that's really hard, right? The first two are actually pretty easy to do. You select your own manuscript, so that's pretty easy. I'd like this thing published, and getting it done, the tools now are fantastic. You know, you just upload your Word document, and you got, you know, some freelance guys will turn that into a fantastic looking book for you, and freelance art director will put a direct jacket on it, and you know, here you go. But then trying to find someone to read it is the problem. There are two things that the current generation of executives will have to tackle in publishing when they say, you know, what are the problems with publishing? There's a lot to tackle, tons and tons to tackle, but the two big ones that occur to me are the changing definition of freedom of speech, right? That is apparently changing in our society extremely rapidly. Freedom of speech isn't what it used to be. And the sort of extra part of freedom of speech is the artificial limits of who can write about what, right? So there's this new perception that certain people shouldn't be allowed to write books. Certain people shouldn't be allowed to write books about certain subjects. Bad people, whoever they are, shouldn't be able to publish books. People who are in the opposite political party that you are in shouldn't be able to publish books. There's a sort of a plethora of sort of restraint of traditional freedom of press. Now, interesting when I think about it, is there is the proviso in all the law around freedom of press. You know, the First Amendment is just a few words, right? It says the government shall make no law, right? It doesn't actually cover freedom of press as we know it, as we work with it. That is based on Supreme Court cases, primarily all sorts of legal cases, but basically Supreme Court cases. And over the years, there's an exception for imminent physical harm. It can't be physical harm out in the future. It has to be imminent physical harm now. The famous case is you can't yell fire in a crowded area, right? Because they're going to run out, someone's going to die. That's not allowed in freedom of speech. Given the amount of guns today, given the amount of threat of violence today, there's an interesting argument to be made about imminent danger in today's world as opposed to when that particular opinion was written. The other issue that's coming up is a copyright issue that publishers are going to have to solve. Right now, there's a few authors trying to solve it, which is crazy. Publishers have to solve, which is the problem of artificial intelligence, right? If you tell a computer, read every book that Nora Roberts published, and now write me a Nora Roberts book that's a Western, right? The computer will turn out a book that sounds a lot like Nora Roberts, and it's going to be a pretty good book. The problem is, who's paying Nora Roberts? And how much are they paying Nora Roberts? And that should be the publisher's main concern, is making sure Nora Roberts and every other author whose book is used in artificial intelligence, if what the computer generates is of a likeness to what they wrote, they should be paid. Right. So I've carried on long enough, probably too long? Am I too long?
Not at all.
Okay. Questions? Yeah.
In Wyoming, did you have indoor plumbing?
I still spend time in Wyoming in a structure that doesn't, but we did. And there's a great book by McPhee, Rising from the Plains. Tells a story about Tom Love, a geologist who's very old now, but he grew up in a one-room schoolhouse. It's a great story. He grows up in a one-room schoolhouse. There are bullet holes in the windows, and they have to get there early so they can break the ice in the creek, bring in the water that they're going to have to drink. They have to fire up the wood-burning stove, and they have to wait for it to get warm enough for the ink to melt in the inkwells so that they can write. And that's from not that long ago, right? And that's the amazing thing about the West is the history is, you know, my great grandfather was a publisher when, you know, Custer's Last Stand out, right? It's recent. And the fantastic thing is there's no structures left, right? If you think about the Plains Indians, they did not build stuff. They were nomadic, right? They had teepees and they took them with them. And all that stuff is historically is gone. There's some bows and arrows and there's some hatchets and stuff like that. But basically, the oldest buildings out there are from, you know, the 1880s. And they're old wood buildings from the 1880s. And you can still see them all over. A lot of them fall apart now, but you can see all the homestead houses from the Homestead Act and people coming out and, you know, putting up their house. The ranch I grew up on has a thing called Fairbanks Draw. And it's a beautiful draw on the land, the hills, no trees, beautiful view of the mountains, fantastic. And you go up there and we realized that there was a guy who lived there named Fairbanks. And Sheridan, Wyoming is 21 miles away. And he had a horse-drawn wagon, which he took to town overland there was no road overland over these hills. So, you know, 2-day expedition to get some anything, flour, whatever. So it is a remote place in the world.
What was your schooling like?
What?
When you were growing up, what was your schooling like in Wyoming?
Oh, it's great. I have all these excuses. I can't spell for shit. I can't do grammar. You know, the one schoolhouse we had eight grades, 11 kids. So I had a kid in my grade, my sister had a kid in her grade, and the teacher would teach them sequentially. So, you know, second grade, she'd be teaching second grade, everybody else would be doing their work. And then she'd teach fourth grade, and then she'd teach, you know, she'd teach like that. She used to pick us up in her old Corvair on her way out to school from town. School was another 8 miles past our house. She used to pick us up. And, you know, but the school was fine. I mean, Mrs. Pilch was just nasty, just like her name. And then the next year we had Mrs. Duffy, who was just like her name. She's fantastic. And they did a good job. We were always caught up with the kids in town. We never got behind the kids in town. Yeah.
Were you surprised by any of the things that occurred to you that happened in the process of writing this book? If so, what were they? And if so, also, were any of them emotional feelings that you didn't anticipate having as a writer of this book?
Yeah, well, there's people in the room who tell you, when I start talking about emotional stuff, I start to cry like a faucet, like, so, yeah, there was, if you spend the amount of time that I spent looking backwards at your life, there's a ton of emotional stuff. And you remember, it's really interesting. I remembered a lot more than I thought I was going to remember. Because as you're in this, and, I'm calling up my sister and I'm saying, do I have this right? Sandy Seymour was in your class, right? And she going, yeah, Sandy Seymour. He lived on the hill in that single wide, yeah. Leon Hawkeye was his dad. It might have been his dad. Could have been his grandfather, no one was really clear. Okay. And then you start to think about these characters, and then you remember your times with them. And so it's a very rich experience. Difficult. I had a very interesting mother, and it was good to admire her, because so often we don't admire our parents. So it was good to have. As I was doing this, I thought, oh my God, she was fucked up. But then I think, but you know what? Look at this. Look what she did. Moved us all from Park Avenue to a ranch in the middle of nowhere. How much courage does that take? A lot. With the new boyfriend. So anyway, there's a lot of emotion in it. A lot of emotion.
I was going to say, who is one of the authors you're most proud of having published?
I think of it more as books. And there's,
Right.
I used to get asked that question a lot. I don't get asked that much anymore. So thanks. What book are you proudest of publishing? So, authors, it's more difficult because I have personal friendships with many of them who I sort of treasure. But as far as publishing the books, the two books that always stood out for me was Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. I had this thing I used to do. Sally remembers, I always had to sort of quantify, have some sort of structure around the decision. So in this case, I thought, well, what books am I proudest of? What does it take for a book to be proud of it? I thought, you have to sell a lot of copies because it can't be an inconsequential book. You have to have personally had something to do with making it a big hit, right? And it has to do good in the world. So it has to have, at the end of the day, lots of influence on lots of people to make their lives better. So the adult side was Atul Gawande, Being Mortal, which I can recommend to everybody. It's just a fantastic book. He's a fantastic human being. And the other was Chicka Chicka Boom Boom, which is a children's book. And when I do, it is so fantastic. When I'm in a room of, call it college age or just after college age kids, I sort of look at them and I think, oh, they're this old. And then I think, when did we publish that? Oh, shit, it's going to work. So I say, how many of you remember learning your alphabet by Chicka Chicka Boom Boom? And almost every hand always goes up, which is so cool, which is the great power. This is the fantastic thing about this business, right? If you do something that's good and can deliver a message, you can reach, hundreds of thousands, millions of people with something that's going to be helpful to them and useful in their lives. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were involved in children's publishing.
Yeah.
Right? And you also went through this journey of going through your own childhood.
Yeah.
And writing about it.
Yeah.
Discussing it publicly. What were some of the lessons you learned from children's publishing and you related or apply it at all to your own career?
I wrote a couple children's books under a pseudonym back when I was a children's publisher. And the remarkable thing about children's books is, I'm not talking young adult, I'm talking for children, right? Young books, is how difficult it is. If you read The Cat in the Hat by Dr. Seuss and pay attention to the internal syllable by syllable rhymes, and you realize how much fun you as an adult are having reading the book, and how much that little kid on your lap is enjoying reading the book. It's a fantastic skill. What I learned in children's publishing was deeply, deeply appreciate that skill. It didn't actually tie much to my growing up. I remember I loved Eloise at the Plaza. And I got to be the publisher of Eloise at the Plaza. How cool is that, right? Fantastic. Even though Kay Thompson was about as difficult author as I ever ran into over all those years. My God, she was difficult. And she had a throwdown with the Trumps. It was truly spectacular. When they bought the Plaza Hotel, they wanted to do these special editions with, big gold foil and all that shit. And they convinced Kay to, Kay would never listen to me for shit. She just, basically, she had no use for her publisher at that point in time. But she got Ivanka Trump somehow charmed her. And so down the road we went. Special New York Plaza edition of Eloise at the Plaza with the two Trumps. And crazy Kay Thompson. It was, she's a recluse. She's living in Liza Minnelli's apartment. It was just, we're just looking ahead going, oh, what the hell? So in that way, there was a connection to when I was a kid, but that's about the only one I can think of. Yeah.
When you got to universities, which I assume you knew, how did you feel having been trained in this schoolroom out in Wyoming?
Well, I felt great. I went to school in California, and lived through a whole bunch of Wyoming winters, being responsible for shoveling the snow out of the front of the garage. Wahoo! I tell you, growing up on the cattle ranch, is work. I mean, work. So I never had that issue of, people, first of all, I drank my way through college and wasn't that concerned with my grades, but people would get all crazy about, oh my God, I studied for, 8 hours. I was like, well, I only studied for an hour, but why are you complaining about 8 hours of work? Seems that'd be pretty normal. So I went to Sheridan High School in Sheridan, Wyoming for a year, and then I went back east. So I went to a school in Connecticut because I was having a difficult time in Wyoming, as it turned out. School called Pomfret, small, in that point, extremely liberal. Went there because it was the first school that had girls and was incredibly liberal. Had a huge ABC scholarship program. It's where I met Tony Sally, the guy who used to come over and visit me. It was a fantastic little tiny school. And then college was just, oh my God, was it fun. Nothing in the book about college. I thought I can't go there. Unappealing. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the tension inside a corporate publisher between the people who understandably say, okay, we gotta pay a lot of attention to the bottom line here. Books don't make any money, they're gonna disappear, versus the other mission that the publisher has, which is to bring real talent to the readership.
Yeah.
Almost without regard to whether it's gonna sell books. It's gotta be some sort of tension. How do you make those decisions?
The big publishing houses, called the Big Five, have imprints that are set up that do call them the literary books or the complex books, poetry books that aren't going to sell a ton. And they have people there who work and really enjoy working on those books and are really good at it. And most publishers, certainly at our place, the ownership was, no one goes into publishing to make a shitload of money. It's not a big money-making thing. So almost everybody who works in the business loves books, and most of the people with ownership stakes in the smaller and medium-sized ones love books. And most of the people making the decisions in the big corporate ones love books. The people who have all the publishers' jobs, the people who are deciding what books to publish, love books. Even if your CEO is a pure goddamn bean counter corporate suck-up guy, the people deciding what books get published have a great love of the books. And it's a magical thing, you get to all day long find the books that matter, and the people, when they find them, they all share them, and there's this energy that happens around, oh my God, look what we have here. And better yet, and we only paid $25,000 for it. There's very few people who have a publishing job that I know of who don't care deeply about books and delivering great books and literary books, entertaining books, scientific books, history, nonfiction, that whole spectrum, equal value. Different people love different parts. But if you're a big general publisher, you value them all.
It seems to me that from what I've been reading about AI, artificial intelligence, that more and more AI is brought in to sort of run or do certain things in certain businesses.
Yeah.
Would that be the case with the
Sure.
emotions of the people who love books?
Sure, there's a lot for AI to do,
Okay.
right? So when you're trying to sort out, do you have the right postal rates? Oh, AI is very useful in that.
Oh, okay.
What are our efficiencies in warehousing? AI is extremely useful.
Okay.
Should this book be published? Not so much, not yet, maybe in the future, not yet, not yet, right? It is an intuitive thing. You find there's no guideposts to the new, there's plenty of guideposts to, if you're gonna do a mystery that's a cozy mystery that's set here, there's guideposts all over the places it's working. But when you get that book that you say, oh, whoa, I haven't read one like this before, there's no guidepost that says people are gonna like that or not like it. It's you. You love it or you don't love it. And then can you convince a bunch of other people in the company to love it? Machine's not gonna do that for you. Not yet, maybe someday. I don't wanna be around when it happens. That's what
And I wanted to follow along that line of thinking, because you alluded to, sort of the New York Times case against Google and Microsoft about
Yeah.
ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And the example you gave is pretty clear when you ask them to read a book by a particular author and then they
Yeah.
create a book. How about something in between when you ask a question and it's an amalgam of different sources, so it's
Really
very
good.
hard to monitor.
Really good question and really difficult. Really, really difficult. Right? How do you define fair use is out there, right? So clearly, you can scan an entire book and use one or two sentences of it, that's fair use. There's an argument for transformative use. When we took on Google back in the day, when the AAP took on Google, that was a big fight. They ended up settling and agreeing that they couldn't copy in copyright works. They could copy out of copyright works, but not in copyright. And we always wondering why they wanted non-consumptive research rights. They kept saying, we want non-consumptive rights. We're going, if you're not going to use the book, why do you care? Well, we want to be able to say for scholars how many times the word shit was used in novels in the 1800s and how many times it's used now. And you think, well, that's bizarre, but okay. And of course, they knew all the way back then, what they wanted was this huge corpus so they could feed it all in and have non-consumptive rights, meaning they could train artificial intelligence. I assume they knew all the way back then. We were completely goddamn clueless. I remember the guy who ran it for Google was the head of NASA engineering, computer engineer for NASA. And we went out, Richard Sarnoff and I were the lead negotiators for 8 years with Google. And I went out to him one day for breakfast and he said, well, blah, 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 in the cloud. And I said, the hell is the cloud? And this is probably, I don't know, 20 some years ago. He said, what the hell is the cloud? And he said, oh, well, it's not here yet. And I said, well, what is it? He said, well, if you can imagine, it's distributed computing. So the ability to compute it's called the cloud because it's just going to be in the air around you. Don't talk this crap to me. What are you talking about? And, sure enough, like 3 years later, I'm reading something, the cloud, whoa, what the hell? So I think these guys see way over the horizon. And this will be the problem with artificial intelligence. And you're going to put a bunch of publishers, schmoes like me, in with guys from Google and all these, OpenAI, all these, whoa, we will not have the technical expertise. Now, last time it worked out fine because one of the beauties of copyright is the penalty is per work, right? So even for these big guys, if they are found guilty of copying, 4 million records and the cost per work is, I can't remember what it is, $11,000, holy shit, it's billions. So industry acting together, there's leverage. And it's figuring out we should be able to count on Congress, Congress is not going to tackle copyright. Yeah.
Are there any books that you chose not to publish that you wish you had?
Oh, so many mistakes. So many mistakes. I think back, I'll give you one. When I was young at Simon's I turned down Rainbow Fish. You familiar with Rainbow Fish? I don't know, it sold 10 million copies. It's a little kid's book. I thought, it's got this ink that's glittery. The text sucks. The art is not that good. but the ink had glitter on it. And it glimmered when you read it. And I thought, no, that's ridiculous. No one's gonna buy that. But yeah, there's a lot. They are almost endless. The ones and so many that you value wrong. I mean, I remember thinking that Random House was insane. We offered Michelle and Barack Obama, I don't know, $38 million or something. I mean, we offered them a ton of money. And Random House came in like double, like $60 million. These guys are insane. Why would you do that? Oh, I know why. You want to go to dinner and lunch with Barack and Michelle. So there's a good reason to do it. But other than that, it was a financial disaster. Of course, it was cheap at that. They could have spent $100 million and made money. So there were constant, and it's dangerous, right? Because that happens to you enough and you kept thinking, well, I'm not going to lose this next one then. And, trying to figure out what the books are worth was very difficult.
I was curious about that because you mentioned, oh, this book is great, we got for only $25K. And how many, obviously you've been in the big bidding wars, and you've also found the tiny things that you paid nothing for. Where did you find more success in the
Big
bidding?
ones unequivocally.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, because they have,
You have
you get it right or you get it wrong, but it's a big market. Whereas if you're gonna pick the mystery, you're gonna figure out that this guy in Norway has figured out a new genre called the noir thriller, and you're gonna figure that out? Or is it easier to say, oh, here comes Barack Obama. We're gonna sell a lot of those. You're gonna sell a lot of them. So it's easier in that regard. The risks are higher. It's bigger stakes gamble, right? You can publish an awful lot of books at 25,000 each and not lose your shirt. But you don't, it's pretty hard. They're few and far between. There is a model that says pay really small advances, $5,000, publish a shitload of them, make a little money on each one because you're cheap on the author advance, make a little money on each one, and then of the 300 that you're publishing, one, boom, and you win. And that at St. Martin's Press, so that was the model, and Sally, you'll correct me, but I think All Creatures Great and Small was that, It was a little book by some vet. Tom McCormick went over to England, read it in his hotel room, thought it was okay, paid a couple $1,000. And people are still reading it today, and they're making the second TV series about it this year, and it's amazing. So it does happen, and that's a model, but it's become more like Hollywood. It's a big hit-driven thing. You want the big hits. Get that author who's on book 3, the book 1 sells here, book 2 here, book 3 here. Get them at book 4 and blow it up and make it huge. That's a lot of where the energy goes.
This isn't really a question, just a comment. People have lately seemed so depressingly predictable in some ways when I read the news that I find it beautiful and inspiring that it's not so easy to predict the nature of human beings, literary life.
Oh, publishing, I always used to think of it as the black box, right? You would do all your work. You'd make that book as good as you can. The editors, the art department, the publicity plan is fantastic, the marketing plan is fantastic. And you have 4 books like that on the list. And you put them all in the black box. One's a hit, 3 are bombs. No idea why. No idea. We published a book called The Nearly Normal Family once, which I thought was just a fantastic thriller. The same time, we published a book called The Silent Patient, which I thought, oh, that's pretty good, it's okay, but done before, And The Silent Patient sold 3 million copies. It's still selling today. Nearly Normal Family, 20,000 and out. I still say that was one of the best thrillers I've ever read. But you just can't tell. It's like, it's a magic thing. And it's one of the things that makes the business so fun and so compelling, is there's a bit of magic. You know, you can't predict what's gonna work. You really can't. You can predict sometimes when celebrities, you know, I remember Marcus Allen, who was a famous running back, you know, Heisman Trophy, you know, pro football. He wanted to write his story. And we had a great meeting with him. And I said, look, but you can't write, you know, student body right. And then we were on the 20-yard line and that doesn't work. We need to hear about you and the wild stuff that you were doing and what was life like for you as you became this famous, iconic figure, And he said, oh, would you want to hear about like me and OJ and what we used to do after the game? I said, yeah, that's what we want to hear. We want to hear all about that shit. And he said, well, tell you what, I'm under a gag order right now because the OJ trial is happening, right? I'm under a gag order right now, but you know, when the book comes, I'm gonna write all that stuff. I said, oh shit, you're on. And so we paid a lot of money for Marcus Allen's book. And you know, a year or two goes by and in comes the manuscript. And it wasn't a year, probably 18 months goes by, OJ trial's over, here comes a manuscript. And it's full of student body right, we were on the 20-yard line. What the hell? I called him up and I said, Marcus, you promised not to do this and the other stuff. He said, I never realized. He said, you gotta realize, my mom's still alive. And he said, and it was either his girlfriend or his wife. He said, I can't write that stuff. I said, why didn't you tell us that before you took the money, you know? Anyway, it is, even things you are sort of sure of get derailed in good ways and bad ways. I mean, I remember Simon & Schuster, we had a book with Gilda Radner, which was gonna be a big book. She was a big comic, Saturday Night Live, all that stuff. And we had made the assumption it was gonna sell X number of copies. And Gilda died on Pug Day. And the book was a monster. I mean, huge. It's because she died on Pug Day. So you don't ever know, you know, what's gonna work and what isn't, which makes it fun. And it makes it, at least for me, it made it really fun.
Thank you.
Okay?
Oh, I have a comment, not a question, John. I listened to your book on Audible, and you do the recording,
Yeah.
and it's just as lively and authentic as you are, and also very upbeat and optimistic, which not every publisher is.
Yeah.
So it's really a pleasure.
Well,
to
thank
read
you.
your
Thank you.
book.
Thanks, everybody.